What happens when a prejudiced restaurant manager tries to eject the wrong black woman, assuming she won't stand up to his blatant discrimination, until she makes one phone call to the owner? You won't believe his reaction. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. The restaurant hummed with a quiet but lively energy, the kind that signaled the start of a bustling evening. Soft jazz floated through the air, mingling with the gentle clink of glasses and silverware. Naomi Brooks sat near the center of the dining room, her table adorned with a crisp white tablecloth and polished cutlery. She had arrived precisely at the reservation time. Punctuality was her signature. Her poised presence blended effortlessly with the refined atmosphere. The staff moved gracefully around her, greeting new patrons and escorting them to their seats. Naomi's gaze briefly followed a couple being led to a nearby table. They had just walked in, clearly without a reservation. She glanced back at her menu, but quietly registered the moment. "Everything all right, ma'am?" a waiter asked, pausing to refill her water glass. Naomi offered a polite smile. "Just waiting on my meal, thank you." She leaned back in her chair, eyes subtly scanning the room. Around her, groups of business professionals and couples filled the space, enjoying their evening. Naomi appreciated these quiet moments of observation. There was something beautiful about witnessing life unfold around her. Near the entrance, the restaurant manager, Richard Gaines, stood with his arms crossed, his sharp suit perfectly pressed, mirroring the stern look on his face. His finger tapped against his earpiece as he listened intently. Whatever he heard made him stand even straighter. A server approached him, questioning with a glance. Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice. "They're on their way. We need to be prepared." His eyes swept over the dining room, pausing as they landed on Naomi's table. A faint frown crept onto his face. He glanced at the reservation list in his hand, tapping his pen against it before signaling for the waiter to come closer. "Table 9, Richard murmured, nodding toward Naomi. "We might need to clear it. Keep it open just in case." The waiter hesitated. "Sir, she's already seated." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "Just do it. I'll take care of it." Oblivious to the exchange, Naomi smoothed her napkin and glanced briefly at her phone. Around her, the restaurant continued to hum with soft conversation. Richard's calculating gaze lingered on her table, clearly plotting his next move. Naomi traced a finger along the menu, debating between two entrees. Meanwhile, the waiter quietly returned to Richard's side. "She's still there?" the waiter said, voice low, as he glanced toward Naomi's table. Richard's jaw tightened. "Fine, I'll handle it." He straightened his jacket, his brisk steps betraying his irritation as he crossed the room. Naomi noticed him approaching, setting down her menu, as her eyes calmly met his. "Good evening," Richard began, offering a thin, insincere smile. "I'm Richard Gaines, the manager here. I'm afraid we have a slight situation." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "What kind of situation?" Richard folded his hands, his voice carefully measured. "A very important guest will be arriving shortly, and we need to make some adjustments to our seating. Unfortunately, I'll need to ask you to vacate this table." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "Vacate? I have a reservation, and I was seated on time." "I understand," Richard said, his smile tightening. "But as I mentioned, this is an unusual circumstance. I'm sure you can appreciate the needs of the restaurant." Naomi leaned back, her tone calm yet firm. "I actually don't understand. There are at least 3 tables seated after me. Why not ask someone else to move?" For a brief moment, Richard's composed mask cracked, irritation flickering in his eyes. "Ma'am, I'm asking you because this is a business decision," he replied curtly. "We need to maintain a certain atmosphere for tonight's special guests." "Atmosphere?" Naomi repeated, her tone sharpening. "And you believe my presence disrupts that?" His professional facade slipped further. "Look," Richard said, his voice dropping to a hushed, clipped tone. "This isn't personal. I'm giving you the opportunity to handle this discreetly. Don't make it harder than it needs to be." Naomi straightened in her chair, her gaze narrowing. "Is that a threat?" Richard exhaled sharply, casting a glance around to ensure no other diners could overhear. "I'm simply suggesting that if you choose not to cooperate, I'll involve security. I'd prefer not to escalate the situation." Naomi held his stare, her calm unwavering. Then, with deliberate ease, she folded her napkin and placed it beside her plate. I see, she said, her voice cool. So, your solution is to intimidate paying customers to make room for someone you deem more important. Is that it? Richard's jaw tightened, his voice dropping lower. You're not the first person I've had to deal with like this. I can make this as easy or as difficult as you want. Naomi's smile grew, but it never touched her eyes. Her calm exterior now carried a sharp edge of steel. I think I'll stay right here, she replied softly. His nostrils flared as he straightened, visibly frustrated. Fine, I'll give you 5 minutes to reconsider before I return with security. Without waiting for her response, Richard turned on his heel and walked briskly away, leaving Naomi at the table as quiet murmurs spread among nearby diners. A few patrons exchanged glances, having caught snippets of the tense exchange. Naomi took a slow, steady breath, grounding herself as she watched Richard from across the room. He was speaking to 2 staff members, his gestures sharp and his expression tight. Whatever he was saying, it was clear he wasn't finished with her yet. Her fingertips grazed the edge of the table as she sat still, her mind racing, but her face calm. This wasn't her first time encountering someone like Richard Gaines. She knew his type well. The kind of manager who believed his position allowed him to decide who belonged and who didn't. Naomi's eyes shifted to the other diners. Some were oblivious, lost in their meals and conversations. Others glanced in her direction, quickly averting their eyes when she noticed them. Whispers floated through the air, followed by awkward silences as they pretended not to see. Closing her eyes for a brief moment, Naomi exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about her. She could feel it deep in her bones. Richard had likely done this before, maybe countless times, targeting others who had quietly left without a fuss. How many people had been humiliated like this, ushered out under the pretense of special guests or business decisions? The click of polished shoes against the marble floor pulled her attention back. Richard was returning, this time with 2 uniformed security guards at his side. His expression had hardened further, the thin veil of civility now replaced by impatience. Ma'am, Richard began, his voice clipped and sharp. I warned you. Naomi remained seated, her eyes calmly locked on his. Warned me about what exactly? Richard crossed his arms. Your refusal to cooperate. I've politely asked you to vacate the table. Now you're disrupting the restaurant's operations. This is unacceptable. The 2 guards stood behind him, silent but unmistakably present. Naomi could feel their eyes on her, waiting for any sign of resistance, any reason to intervene. And yet, Naomi said evenly, you haven't explained why I'm the one being asked to leave. There are plenty of tables occupied by guests who arrived after me. Why not ask them? Richard's lips pressed into a thin, tense line. For a brief moment he hesitated. Then, the words Naomi had anticipated finally slipped from his mouth. Because this establishment caters to a certain clientele, Richard said coldly. And I'm afraid you don't align with the image we're presenting tonight. Naomi's breath caught in her chest, but her face didn't betray the fire building within. There it was, no vague excuses, no careful phrasing, just the raw, ugly truth. Say that again, she said softly, her voice carrying an edge that cut through the room's soft ambiance. Richard's eyes darted around the dining room, as if realizing too late the weight of his words. He shifted uncomfortably, but instead of retracting, he pressed on. We have a responsibility to uphold certain standards, he said, squaring his shoulders. Frankly, I don't believe you meet those standards. Naomi rose slowly, each movement deliberate. Though she didn't match Richard's height, the energy she exuded filled the space between them. The guard straightened, but she made no aggressive move. Instead, she adjusted her dress, reaching for her purse. You think you can get away with this, Naomi said softly, almost to herself. Then louder, her voice cool but commanding. You believe you can treat people like this and face no consequences? Richard's posture stiffened. I've made my decision clear, he replied curtly. Now, if you'll step aside, we can resolve this quietly. Naomi studied him for a moment, the room growing silent around them. Finally, she reached into her purse, pulling out her phone with calm precision. Wait, she said, holding up a finger. Before you have security escort me out, I just need to make a quick call. Richard's brow furrowed, his confidence flickering. He crossed his arms tightly as Naomi turned away, dialing a number with quiet resolve. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. uncertain whether to act or wait for further orders. "Go ahead," Richard said dismissively, his tone laced with condescension. "I'm sure whoever you're calling will understand perfectly." Naomi didn't respond. She paced a few steps away, her voice low but unwavering as she spoke into the phone. Richard shifted impatiently, his earlier smugness giving way to unease as he observed her. "Sir, should we remove her now?" one of the guards asked. Richard shook his head sharply. "Not yet. Let her finish whatever this is first, then we'll handle it." Though the restaurant's gentle buzz persisted, a sense of discomfort hung in the air. Patrons glanced discreetly at the unfolding scene, sensing that something beneath the surface was about to shift. The tension hung thick over the nearby tables, with a few diners now openly watching the confrontation unfold. Their curiosity was piqued by the growing unease in the room. Naomi ended her call and turned to face Richard, sliding her phone calmly into her purse. "You're going to regret this," she said simply, her voice unwavering. Richard raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth tugging into a smirk. "Oh, really? And why's that?" "Because I just spoke to the owner of this restaurant," Naomi replied evenly. The words struck Richard like a slap. His smirk faltered but returned quickly, masked by a dry laugh. "You called the owner?" "Right," he scoffed. "Let me guess. He's going to burst through the doors any minute now and save the day?" Naomi's eyes never left his. "That's exactly what's going to happen." For a fleeting second, Richard's confidence wavered, but he shook his head. "Ma'am, I don't know who you think you spoke to," Richard said dismissively, "but I'm in constant communication with the owner. Trust me, if he were coming, I'd know." "You're about to find out," Naomi responded, folding her arms across her chest. Richard gestured sharply to the security guards. "This is absurd. Escort her out." The guards exchanged uncertain glances, shifting awkwardly. "Sir, if she really did call the owner," one began hesitantly. "She didn't," Richard snapped, glaring at the guard. "It's a bluff. Just do your job." Before they could take a step, Naomi raised a hand, her gaze sharpening. "If you touch me," she said, her voice calm but edged with quiet authority, "it'll be the last mistake you make in this restaurant." Even the guards hesitated, her words cutting through the air like a blade. Richard stepped closer, his patience wearing thin. "Listen, Nat," he hissed, keeping his voice low. "I don't care who you think you know. I run this place, and I say you're done here. Either leave quietly or I'll have you dragged out." Naomi's eyes didn't waver. "You don't run anything, Richard. And if you're so sure of yourself, why don't you wait just a few more minutes? I have a feeling you'll enjoy what happens next." He scoffed, but his hands tightened into fists at his sides. His eyes darted around, noting the growing number of patrons watching from their tables. Realizing he was losing the upper hand, Richard forced a tight smile and turned to the guards. "Go stand by the entrance. I'll handle this personally," he instructed. Reluctantly, the guards stepped back, leaving Richard and Naomi standing face to face. "Enjoy your little power trip," Naomi said softly, tilting her head slightly. "Because when this is over, you're going to wish you had handled this differently." Richard's jaw tensed, his composure slipping. "You really think a phone call changes anything?" he sneered. "You're just another." He caught himself mid-sentence, biting down the words. Naomi arched an eyebrow. "Go ahead," she said coolly. "Finish that thought." Richard's mouth opened, but he stopped short, his pride keeping him rooted in silence. "You're wasting my time," he muttered instead, pivoting toward the foyer. Before he could take another step, the sharp ring of a phone echoed through the dining room. Richard froze. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, glancing at the screen. His face paled instantly as he recognized the number. Naomi's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "Go ahead. Answer it." Richard hesitated, glancing nervously between Naomi and the phone. His fingers hovered over the screen before he reluctantly swiped to accept the call. "Hello?" His voice, so sharp moments before, now carried an unfamiliar edge of uncertainty. On the other end, a voice, firm, authoritative, and unmistakably displeased, spoke loud enough for the nearby diners to sense the shift in the air. Richard's eyes widened as the color drained from his face. He turned to Naomi, his mouth opening, but no sound emerged. "Hold on," he stammered, clutching the phone tightly. "Let me explain." Naomi crossed her arms, watching him calmly as he floundered under the weight of the call. "I told you," she said softly, tilting her head. "You're going to regret this." Richard's knuckles whitened around the phone, his usual smugness stripped away, leaving only a sheen of sweat across his brow. "Yes, Mr. Warren," Richard stammered, addressing Daniel Warren, the owner of the restaurant. I can explain." Naomi stepped aside, giving Richard space as he stumbled over his words. Nearby patrons watched with open curiosity, the low murmur of the dining room fading as Richard's body language shifted from irritation to desperation. "No, sir, it's not what it looks like," Richard pleaded, his voice thin and strained. "I was just trying to manage the situation. He cast a fleeting glance at Naomi, his words unraveling beneath her unwavering stare. "I didn't mean for it to sound that way." Richard grimaced, wincing as Daniel's voice grew sharper, even from a distance. His free hand twitched, as if he could somehow shield himself from the intensity of the reprimand. "I understand, sir. I understand completely. I'll handle it immediately." When Richard finally turned back to Naomi, his forced confidence was gone, replaced by a mixture of panic and forced humility. "Ma'am," he began, his voice trembling, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Richard's voice trembled slightly. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Please, let's talk this through." Naomi arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. "A misunderstanding?" she echoed, her tone ice cold. "Are you referring to the part where you openly admitted I don't fit the image of this restaurant?" Richard winced visibly. I didn't mean it like that," he stammered. "It was poor phrasing. Completely unintentional." Naomi's gaze held steady. "Then what exactly did you mean, Richard?" His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The silence stretched, interrupted only by the faint hum of Daniel Warren's voice still on the line. Richard brought the phone back to his ear, desperation creeping in. "Mr. Warren, I swear I can handle this. I'll apologize. I'll make it right." Whatever Daniel said next made Richard flinch. He pulled the phone slightly away from his ear as if the words physically stung him. "Of course, sir," Richard said quickly. "Right away." He lowered the phone, swallowing hard. Turning back to Naomi, he forced a weak, unconvincing smile. "Miss Brooks," he began, his voice uneven, "I'd like to formally apologize. My actions earlier were inappropriate and unacceptable. I hope you'll allow me the opportunity to make it up to you." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression unwavering. "Make it up to me?" she repeated. "And how exactly do you plan to do that, Richard?" Richard fumbled for words. I can comp your meal, offer you a future reservation, whatever you'd like." Her smile was faint but cold. "Anything I'd like?" "Yes, absolutely," Richard replied quickly, as if grasping at the chance to salvage the situation. Naomi took a single step closer, lowering her voice just enough for the weight of her words to press against him. "What I'd like," she said slowly, "is for you to explain why you've been treating customers this way for so long. Do you really think I wouldn't notice?" Richard blinked, the color draining from his face. What? No, that's not." Naomi raised a hand, cutting him off. "Save it. I've heard enough," she said coolly. "And something tells me Mr. Warren has too." Richard's phone buzzed again in his hand. His eyes flicked nervously to the screen, hesitating before answering. "Yes, sir." This time, whatever Daniel said left Richard frozen. His lips moved silently, searching for a response that didn't come. Finally, his shoulders slumped, and he exhaled. "Understood, sir. I'll do exactly as you say." Richard hung up, his hand trembling slightly. He looked at Naomi, the fight gone from his eyes. "The owner would like to speak with you," he said quietly, extending the phone to her like a peace offering. Naomi accepted it without a word, lifting it to her ear. "Daniel," she greeted, her tone smooth and steady. "It's good to hear from you." Richard stood awkwardly nearby, his posture stiff as Naomi listened calmly to the man on the other end. With each passing second, Richard's composure unraveled further. His usual bravado was reduced to nervous glances around the room, desperate for some form of reprieve. By the time Naomi ended the call and handed the phone back, Richard looked like a man awaiting his fate. "What did he say?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Naomi's smile sharpened, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You'll find out soon enough." She returned the phone to his trembling hand with quiet confidence. Richard stood rooted to the spot, pale and wide-eyed as though waiting for someone, anyone, to rescue him from the inevitable. Naomi, unbothered, took her seat once more, smoothing her napkin over her lap with the same grace she had maintained all evening. I believe I'll stay for my meal, she said lightly. After all, I do have a reservation. Richard hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed the lump in his throat. Oh, of course, he stammered. I'll make sure everything is perfect. I'm sure you will, Naomi replied, her voice slicing through the remaining tension like glass. Richard retreated toward the kitchen, muttering to the staff as he passed by. The two security guards, now thoroughly confused, exchanged glances and quietly returned to their posts near the entrance. Naomi leaned back, sipping her water as she surveyed the room. The subtle, tranquil energy had shifted. Staff buzzed around with unusual urgency, clearly rattled by the unfolding drama. Though most diners returned to their conversations, a few curious glances lingered her way. It wasn't long before a ripple of excitement swept through the restaurant. The doors opened and an A-list celebrity stepped inside, their magnetic presence immediately drawing the attention of the entire room. Heads turned. Conversations stalled. Even the waitstaff paused mid-step. Naomi watched quietly, her face unreadable. The celebrity, dressed impeccably in designer attire, scanned the restaurant while their entourage arranged seating. But then, something unexpected happened. The celebrity's gaze fell directly on Naomi. Their face lit up with instant recognition. Ignoring their entourage, the star strode confidently toward Naomi's table, drawing even more attention as diners whispered amongst themselves. Naomi? They called warmly, their voice cutting through the hushed air. Naomi looked up, offering a subtle smile as the tension that had hovered over the room finally began to dissolve. The voice cut through the hushed atmosphere, warm and unmistakable. I didn't know you were in town, Naomi. Naomi stood, offering a polite smile. It's been a while, Leo. The celebrity, Leo Calloway, glanced at the empty chair across from her. Mind if I join you? Not at all, Naomi said, gesturing to the seat. The restaurant staff visibly tensed, their movements becoming rushed and frantic. From his position near the kitchen, Richard froze mid-step. His pale complexion somehow managed to drain further as he watched Leo approach Naomi's table. Leo leaned back casually, his effortless charisma spreading across the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. So, he said with a grin, what's new with you? Feels like it's been forever. Just a quiet night out, Naomi replied with a small smirk, though it's turned into something a bit more eventful than I expected. Leo chuckled, glancing around. Eventful? This place always has a little drama, but at least the food makes up for it. A nervous waiter approached, carefully placing their drinks and meals on the table. Naomi's eyes caught the subtle tremble in the waiter's hands as he set down the plates. He hurried away, casting a wary glance over his shoulder at Richard. Naomi and Leo fell into easy conversation, the energy at their table breaking through the restaurant's subdued air. Naomi shared updates about her latest work, while Leo recounted stories from his recent projects and travels. Their connection was effortless, and their laughter drew occasional glances from nearby diners. Richard hovered in the background like a ghost, his usual bravado now replaced with dread and disbelief. His eyes flickered repeatedly toward Naomi and Leo, as though expecting or dreading what might happen next. His expression shifted from thinly veiled panic to forced neutrality whenever staff passed by. At one point, Leo leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. All right, spill it. What's really going on here? You seem sharper than usual. Naomi's smile didn't waver. Let's just say the manager and I had a little misunderstanding about my reservation, she said, her voice light but edged with meaning. But don't worry, I think it's been handled. Leo's gaze flickered briefly toward Richard, his brow raising. Misunderstanding? He looks like he's about to pass out, Leo observed, chuckling softly. I'm sure he's just having an off night, Naomi replied. Their conversation drifted on, unbothered by the watchful eyes in the room. Naomi noted the subtle shift in the staff's demeanor, their attentiveness suddenly dialed up. Every glass was refilled the instant it approached empty. Each course arrived with precise care, as though the entire evening hinged on her satisfaction. By the time they finished, the restaurant had regained some of its usual rhythm. Yet, the undercurrent of tension still lingered in the air. Leo stood, adjusting his sleek jacket as he flashed a grin. This was fun, he said. Let's not wait so long to catch up next time. Agreed, Naomi replied, rising from her seat as well. As they made their way toward the exit, Leo paused briefly, his gaze settling on Richard, who lingered near the kitchen, his shoulders taut and gaze downcast. "Nice place," Leo said, though his tone carried little warmth. "Shame about the management." Richard didn't respond. He stood frozen, his expression carved into quiet desperation as reality began to settle over him like a weight. The next morning, Naomi returned to the restaurant, this time with Daniel Warren at her side. Sunlight streamed through the wide windows, illuminating the polished floors and empty dining room. The atmosphere was calm, a stark contrast to the unease that lingered the night before. At a corner table, Richard sat with his hasp tightly in front of him. His eyes flicked nervously toward Naomi as she entered, but he quickly averted his gaze, his posture stiff. Richard stood as they approached, forcing a strained smile. "Mr. Warren, Miss Brooks," he greeted quickly. "I just want to start by saying how sorry I am. I realize I made a terrible mistake, and I want to apologize to both of you." Daniel gestured for them to sit, his expression thoughtful but stern. "Mistakes happen, Richard," Daniel said evenly. "But I need to understand exactly what happened and why. Naomi is a valued guest, and what she experienced last night is unacceptable." Richard's smile faltered, but he nodded quickly. "I take full responsibility, sir. I let the pressure get to me. With Leo Calloway arriving, I panicked. I didn't mean anything by it." Naomi arched a brow slightly but remained quiet, allowing Daniel to steer the conversation. "Panic is one thing," Daniel said, his voice steady. "But telling someone they don't fit the ambiance? That doesn't sound like panic. It sounds personal." Richard's face flushed. "I didn't mean it that way," he stammered. "It was poor phrasing. I swear it won't happen again." Daniel leaned back, eyeing him carefully. "You've been with us a long time, Richard. This is the first time I've had to address something like this with you," Daniel said. "Is it really just a lapse in judgment?" Naomi's eyes hardened slightly. "You believe that, Daniel?" Daniel turned to her, conflicted. "Everyone deserves the benefit of the doubt, Naomi." "Not this time," she replied coolly. "Richard didn't just panic. He's been treating customers like this for a long time. Last night wasn't new. It was just the first time someone called him out for it." "The benefit of the doubt, Naomi. If this was just one bad night—" "It wasn't," Naomi interrupted firmly. Richard's head snapped toward her. "That's not true," he blurted, though his voice lacked conviction. Naomi ignored him, keeping her focus on Daniel. "This isn't about one incident," she said, her tone unwavering. "This is about a pattern of behavior you haven't noticed because you weren't here to see it." Daniel frowned, shifting in his chair. "What are you suggesting?" "That this isn't the first time Richard's treated someone like this," Naomi replied. "I'm willing to bet if we talk to the staff, we'll hear more. And if we reach out to customers, even more will come forward." Richard's face paled. Panic flickered in his eyes. "You don't have any proof," he said quickly, his voice tight. Naomi's gaze narrowed. "Not yet, but I will." Daniel rubbed his temple, visibly torn. "Richard's been with us for years, Naomi. I've never had reason to question his professionalism before." "That's because people like him know how to hide it," Naomi replied coolly. "They don't show their true colors to the people they need to impress. They save it for those they think won't fight back." Richard shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenching. "That's not fair," he muttered. Naomi's eyes hardened. "Fair?" she shot back. "You want to talk about fair, Richard? How fair is it to humiliate paying customers just because they don't fit your idea of what this place should look like?" Daniel raised a hand, his voice calm but firm. "Let's not turn this into a shouting match." He turned back to Naomi, his expression serious. "If you believe there's more to this, I'm willing to investigate. But I need more than accusations. I need facts." "You'll have them," Naomi said confidently. Daniel nodded slowly. "All right, Richard, I'm placing you on probation while we look into this. You'll stay away from the restaurant until we get to the bottom of it." Richard looked like he wanted to argue, but the words never came. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, sir," he mumbled. Daniel turned back to Naomi. "If there's a pattern, we'll find it. But until then, let's keep this discreet." Naomi's smile was tight. "Of course, Daniel. Discretion is what I do best." Later that morning, Naomi began her investigation with the restaurant staff. She knew they would hold the key to uncovering Richard's behavior. Her first stop was the kitchen, where the head chef, a stocky man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, orchestrated the lunch preparations. "Excuse me," Naomi said, stepping carefully into the bustling space. The chef turned, setting down a ladle. "Miss Brooks," he greeted, offering a polite nod. "I heard about what happened last night. That shouldn't have happened to anyone." "Thank you," Naomi replied. "I need your help. I'm trying to figure out if what happened was isolated, or if it's part of something bigger. Has Richard treated other customers like that before?" The chef's face tightened slightly. His eyes flickered around the kitchen, ensuring no one else was listening. "I've seen things," he said cautiously. "But no one's ever asked about it until now." Naomi took a step closer, her tone gentle but firm. "If he's been targeting people, I need to know. This isn't just about me. It's about anyone else he's hurt." The chef exhaled deeply, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but Richard's always been selective about who gets the best seats. I've heard him tell the hosts to steer certain folks away, usually people who don't fit his idea of classy." Naomi's expression darkened. "And no one's ever reported this?" "Not officially," the chef admitted, "but it's not just customers. Some of the staff left because of him. Richard plays favorites. If he doesn't like you, he makes it hard for you to move up." "Anyone specific?" Naomi pressed. The chef hesitated. "There was a young waiter a while back, great kid, hard worker, but Richard passed him over for promotions, kept finding excuses. Eventually, he left." Naomi nodded, thanking the chef for his honesty before moving on. Over the next few hours, Naomi privately spoke with several other employees. With every conversation, the picture became clearer. One server described how Richard would instruct hosts to seat minority patrons near the kitchen or bar, never near the windows or in prominent areas. A former hostess admitted Richard had pressured her to guide certain customers away from the best tables. The same phrases repeated over and over: ambiance, class, doesn't fit the vibe. By midday, Naomi had gathered enough testimonies to confirm her suspicions, but she knew it wasn't enough for Daniel, at least not yet. The missing piece was the customers. She needed their stories too. That afternoon, Naomi met Daniel in his office at the restaurant. His expression was grave as he looked up from his desk. "Did you find anything?" he asked. "Plenty," Naomi replied, setting a folder down in front of him. "I spoke with the staff. Almost everyone had something to say about Richard." Daniel opened the folder and scanned the notes. His brow furrowed as he read through the accounts. "This is worse than I imagined," he muttered. "It's a pattern," Naomi said quietly. "Daniel," Naomi said firmly, "this has been going on for years. Richard created a toxic environment, and you didn't even notice." Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're right. I trusted Richard to handle things, and now it's clear I made a mistake." "Now that you know," Naomi added, her tone softening slightly, "you can fix it." Daniel looked up at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "We're already gathering staff testimonies." Naomi met his gaze. "The staff's experiences matter, but customers have been impacted too. We need to talk to them. I'm willing to bet there are plenty of people with stories about how Richard treated them." Daniel rubbed his temples, visibly processing the weight of her words. "Do you think they'll come forward?" "They will," Naomi said confidently. "But we have to ask. Start with recent diners. Your reservation system should have their contact information." Daniel nodded slowly. "I'll have someone pull the records. And if you're right, Naomi, I promise I'll make this right. Richard's time here is over." Naomi leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with his. "This isn't just about firing him, Daniel. It's about proving to your staff and customers that this restaurant can change, that you won't let this happen again." Daniel extended his hand. "I'll do whatever it takes." Naomi shook his hand, a faint smile touching her lips. "Good, let's get to work." The day stretched long as Naomi dove into the next phase of her investigation. She set up at a small desk in Daniel's office, surrounded by stacks of reservation logs and customer lists. Daniel's assistant quietly sorted through the records, helping her compile contact details for patrons who had visited the restaurant over the past few months. Her first call was to a young black couple, Lana and Eric Peterson, who had dined at the restaurant 3 weeks prior. Lana hesitated when Naomi introduced herself and explained the purpose of the call. "Well, now that you mention it," Lana said carefully, "we did feel a little out of place. The hostess seemed nervous when she seated us, We were taken to a table near the kitchen, even though I saw open spots by the windows. Naomi jotted notes as she listened. Did you say anything at the time? We tried, Lana replied. But the manager, Richard, I think, just said those tables were reserved and walked off before we could ask again. It didn't feel right, but we didn't want to make a scene. Naomi frowned, recognizing the familiar pattern. Thank you for sharing that, Lana. I appreciate your honesty. It's important for us to hear what happened. Her next call was to Mr. Taylor, a black businessman who had dined alone the previous month. Ah, yes, I remember that night, Taylor chuckled ruefully. I had reserved a table by the window, but they sat me near the bar instead. Did they explain why? Naomi asked gently. The manager claimed there was a last-minute booking that needed the spot. Taylor replied. Naomi's pen hovered over her notepad. Did you notice who was seated there? Oh yes, Taylor said without hesitation. A white couple who arrived after me. They didn't seem to have a reservation, but Richard greeted them like old friends. Naomi's grip on the pen tightened slightly. And how did that make you feel? Dismissed, Taylor replied simply. Like I didn't matter. It's not the first time I've experienced something like that, but it doesn't sting any less. One by one, Naomi made calls. The stories poured in. A pair of sisters, Diane and Felicia, recalled being seated at the smallest table in the restaurant, despite arriving early for their reservation. Another customer, Monique Hayes, a young black professional, described how Richard barely acknowledged her presence when she asked for help with her order. One couple admitted they had stopped visiting the restaurant altogether after feeling unwelcome on more than one occasion. The frustration in their voices was striking, not just from the treatment itself, but from the subtlety of Richard's behavior. His discrimination had been careful, polite enough to avoid direct confrontation, but dismissive enough to leave them feeling invisible. By late afternoon, Naomi had compiled a growing stack of notes. The pattern was undeniable. Richard's behavior had driven away countless black patrons, many of whom had quietly decided never to return. That evening, Naomi returned to Daniel's office to share her findings. Daniel was on a call when she entered, his voice low and serious. When he hung up, he gestured for her to sit. How did it go? He asked, his expression tired but expectant. Exactly how I thought it would, Naomi replied, placing her notebook on his desk. I spoke with 6 black customers today. Every single one of them described being treated unfairly by Richard. He's been systematically prioritizing white patrons while sidelining others. Daniel opened the notebook and skimmed the pages, his brow furrowed deeper with every story. This is worse than I thought, he muttered, shaking his head. Daniel frowned as he flipped through Naomi's notes, his expression darkening with every page. I didn't realize it was this bad, he muttered. It's worse than bad, Naomi said firmly, leaning forward. These are just the people I was able to reach today. Think about how many others had the same experience but never spoke up. Daniel leaned back, running a hand through his hair. What bothers me the most is how subtle it's been. I've dined here dozens of times and never noticed. How does someone hide this for so long? Because people like Richard know how to cover their tracks, Naomi replied. He's careful. Never aggressive enough to draw attention, but just dismissive enough to send a message. He's been doing this for years, Daniel. Daniel let out a heavy sigh, staring at the pile of notes on his desk. What did the customers say when you told them why you were calling? They appreciated it, Naomi said. Most of them thought it was bad luck or just poor service. But when I explained the bigger picture, they understood. Some even said they'd come back if things changed. Daniel nodded slowly. That's something at least. It's not just about getting customers back, Naomi added. This is about accountability. Richard didn't just hurt patrons, he created a culture of exclusion that affected your staff too. That has to change. Daniel met her gaze, his eyes resolute. You're right, we need to fix this. Not just fire Richard and move on, really fix it so it never happens again. Naomi gave a small nod of approval. Good, let's start with transparency. We need to reach out to more customers, listen to their stories, and let them know you're taking this seriously. Daniel straightened in his chair, the weight of responsibility settling in. I'll get my team on it. We'll pull more records and start making calls tomorrow. And you'll hold a staff meeting? Naomi pressed. They need to know what's happening and what's going to change. Absolutely, Daniel said, without hesitation. This restaurant will be better, Naomi. I promise you that. The next morning, the restaurant buzzed with nervous energy. Daniel had called for an all-staff meeting before opening, filling the dining area with murmurs and whispered speculations. Servers, cooks, hosts, and cleaners stood in small clusters, exchanging anxious glances. Naomi arrived early, taking a seat near the front next to Daniel. She had spent the evening organizing her notes, and though her exterior remained calm, she felt a fire burning within. This was the moment the truth would come to light. When the staff had gathered, Daniel stepped forward. His face was set with determination as he raised a hand, calling for silence. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "I know this meeting wasn't scheduled, but it's important. What I'm about to share affects not just our customers, but every single one of you." The room quieted, the weight of his words pulling their attention. Some staff exchanged puzzled looks while others shifted uncomfortably. "For years, we've taken pride in this restaurant being a place where everyone feels welcome," Daniel continued. "But recently, I've learned that hasn't always been the case. Some of our guests, far too many, have been treated unfairly, and I take full responsibility for allowing that to happen." Naomi noticed the surprise ripple across the room. Many staff hadn't expected such a blunt admission from their employer. Daniel gestured toward her. "Naomi Brooks has been working with me to investigate this. She's spoken to customers and staff, and what she's uncovered is deeply concerning. I'll let her explain." Naomi rose, her gaze sweeping across the room as she took center stage. "Thank you, Daniel," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Over the past few days, I've had conversations with staff and customers who've dined here. What I found was a pattern, one that points to discrimination, specifically against Black patrons." The room fell utterly silent. Some employees looked down at their shoes while others stared at Naomi with wide eyes. "For years, certain guests have been treated like second-class citizens," Naomi continued. "They were seated near the kitchen, ignored by management, or turned away under false pretenses. All of this was hidden under the excuse of maintaining the right ambiance." A ripple of discomfort spread through the crowd. Naomi caught the subtle nods from a few employees, those who had suspected this was happening but never dared to voice it. "This wasn't random," Naomi said firmly. "It was orchestrated by Richard Gaines. He used his position to enforce his personal biases, hurting customers and staff alike." A sharp intake of breath broke the silence as murmurs filled the room. All eyes turned toward Richard, who stood stiffly near the back, his face flushed with anger. His jaw clenched as he took a step forward. "This is outrageous," Richard snapped. "You can't accuse me of that without proof." Naomi didn't flinch. "I have proof," she replied, her voice like steel. "I've documented testimonies from customers and staff, people who described exactly how you treated them." The room buzzed with whispers, and for the first time, Richard's confidence visibly wavered. Naomi's gaze remained steady as she addressed Richard, her calm unwavering in the face of his growing desperation. "I have multiple testimonies, Richard," she said, holding the folder up slightly. "Each one describes the same pattern of behavior. Would you like me to read them aloud?" Richard's face darkened, the flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. His mouth opened, but no words came. His eyes flicked nervously around the room, scanning the staff whose expressions ranged from anger to disappointment. The bravado he once relied on was gone. "I made decisions based on what was best for the restaurant," Richard said defensively, his voice thinner than before. "That's my job as a manager." "Your job," Naomi replied sharply, "was to treat every guest with fairness and respect. Instead, you used your position to sideline anyone who didn't match your personal idea of ambiance." Daniel stepped forward, his tone sharper. "Richard, this isn't just about one or two isolated incidents," Daniel said, his eyes narrowing. "This is a pattern that's hurt customers, damaged our reputation, and betrayed the values this restaurant was built on." Richard's gaze darted to Daniel, desperation creeping into his voice. "Sir, I've been loyal to this place for years. I didn't mean for things to go this far. Please, let me fix this." Daniel's expression hardened. "You had years to fix it, Richard," he said firmly. "Instead, you doubled down. Effective immediately, your employment here is terminated." A heavy silence blanketed the room as the weight of Daniel's words sank in. Richard stood frozen, his mouth opening slightly as though to protest, but no sound followed. Daniel turned back to the gathered staff. "I owe all of you an apology," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet room. "I let this happen because I wasn't paying close enough attention. That changes now. Starting today, we're implementing mandatory training on equity and inclusion. I'll also be introducing new measures to ensure no one, customer or staff, is ever treated unfairly again." Naomi watched as the staff absorbed Daniel's words. Some nodded quietly, while others whispered amongst themselves. She felt a flicker of hope, small but real. It was a step forward. There was still work to do, but at least the process had begun. As the staff dispersed, Daniel gestured for Naomi to follow him back to his office. The weight of the morning's revelations lingered in the air, but Naomi's focus remained sharp. She suspected Richard's silence during the meeting wasn't remorse, it was fear. "He's waiting in my office," Daniel said quietly as they walked. "I wanted to give him one last chance to explain himself. I'm not sure what good it'll do, but I need to hear it." Naomi nodded. "He won't admit anything unless he feels cornered, and even then, it won't be the full truth." "Then we'll corner him," Daniel replied as he opened the door. Richard was already seated at the far end of the office, his posture rigid and defensive. His normally polished suit appeared slightly disheveled, and a sheen of nervous sweat glistened on his forehead. His eyes darted up as they entered, flicking quickly between Daniel and Naomi. Daniel took his seat behind the desk and gestured for Naomi to sit beside him. The room felt smaller with the three of them inside, the tension palpable. "Richard," Daniel began, his voice even but firm, "I called you in because I want to understand what happened. This meeting isn't about saving your job. That decision has already been made. This is about accountability." Richard shifted uncomfortably, his fingers gripping the armrests of his chair. I don't know what to say," he stammered. "I made mistakes. I let the pressure get to me." Naomi's eyes narrowed as she leaned forward, arms crossing. "Mistakes?" she repeated coldly. "Is that what you call years of targeting black customers and treating them as less than others? You didn't just let the pressure get to you, Richard. You created a system that excluded people based on race." Richard flinched, his face reddening as he avoided eye contact. "It wasn't about race," he muttered defensively. "I was just trying to maintain the restaurant's image." Daniel's voice cut through the room. "Stop," he said sharply. "We've heard that excuse before. It's meaningless. Explain what you really meant by maintaining the image. Who didn't fit, Richard?" Richard hesitated, his gaze falling to the floor. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Finally, Richard sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Fine," he muttered. "Yes, I focused on certain customers, white customers. They fit the look of the place, the kind that attracted other high-paying clientele. I thought I was protecting the business." Naomi's eyes flashed as she leaned closer. "So you're admitting you treated black customers differently because you didn't think they fit the look? Do you hear how twisted that sounds?" Richard's pale face lifted slightly. "It wasn't personal," he mumbled weakly. "It was about the bottom line." Naomi's expression hardened. "Bottom line?" she shot back. "This isn't just about the numbers, Richard. You didn't just manage the restaurant. You sent a message to people, over and over, that they didn't belong here." Daniel exhaled deeply, leaning back in his chair. His face was grim. "You've betrayed everything this restaurant stands for," Daniel said coldly. "I trusted you to uphold our values, and you twisted them into something ugly." Richard's voice cracked as he scrambled for words. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered, his head hanging low. "I thought I was helping the restaurant. I thought—" "You thought wrong," Daniel interrupted, his voice rising. "You hurt people, Richard. Not just customers, but staff, people who had to follow your orders, who watched you push others aside because they didn't fit the image you wanted to create. And now you're sitting here pretending this was some kind of strategy?" Daniel's eyes narrowed. "It's disgusting." Richard's head dropped into his hands, his ragged breaths the only sound in the room. I don't know what to say," he murmured. "Start with the truth," Naomi said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "You owe that to every person you dismissed, ignored, or humiliated. Admit what you did, Richard. Take responsibility for it. Richard lifted his head slowly, exhaustion etched into his face. I targeted black customers because I thought they wouldn't complain, he admitted quietly. I thought focusing on high-profile white clients would make the restaurant look better. I didn't think anyone would notice. Well, they noticed, Daniel said coldly, and now you'll face the consequences. Richard nodded weakly, the last shreds of defiance draining from him. I understand, he whispered. Daniel stood, signaling the end of the meeting. You'll never work here, or in this industry again. Leave your keys and go. Richard rose shakily, casting one final glance at Naomi before shuffling out of the office. When the door clicked shut behind him, Daniel turned to Naomi. His expression carried the weight of anger and regret. You were right, he said quietly, about all of it. Naomi nodded. Now it's time to fix it, she replied. The afternoon sun streamed through Daniel's office windows, casting long shadows across his polished desk. Naomi sat across from him, her notes laid neatly in front of her. The tension from the confrontation with Richard had dissipated, replaced by a quiet but determined energy. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Naomi, he began, his voice thoughtful. This restaurant has been my pride and joy for years. I thought I was building something special, a place where everyone felt welcome. But now I see I failed. I missed what was happening right under my nose. Naomi studied him for a moment, her expression calm but resolute. The important thing is that you see it now, she said. But acknowledging the problem is only the first step. What you do next will define whether this restaurant reflects the vision you had, or continues to reflect Richard's influence. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing her words. I've been thinking about that, he said. Transparency is key. I need to be upfront with the staff and our customers about what happened and what we're doing to fix it. But I don't want to stop there. I want real, systemic change. Naomi leaned forward, a spark of approval flickering in her eyes. Good, because that's exactly what it's going to take. Richard wasn't the only problem. He created a culture that allowed discrimination to thrive. But that culture didn't happen by accident. If you're serious about change, you need to rebuild from the ground up. Daniel exhaled deeply, rubbing his temples as the weight of the conversation sank in. Where do we start? He asked. Start with your staff, Naomi replied. Hold a real equity and inclusion training, not just some box-checking exercise. Bring in experts who can challenge the team, help them recognize their own biases, and create an environment where everyone feels like they belong. Daniel picked up his pen and began jotting down notes. What else? You need a system of accountability, Naomi continued. Anonymous reporting channels, regular reviews, and clear oversight. No one should have the kind of unchecked power Richard did. That includes you, Daniel. Daniel's pen paused and he glanced up, guilt flickering across his face. You're right, he admitted. I've been too hands-off. I trusted Richard to handle things, and that trust was misplaced. Trust is important, Naomi said gently. But so is oversight. You can delegate authority, but you can't delegate accountability. Daniel's expression hardened with resolve. What about our customers? He asked. How do I rebuild their trust? Naomi's gaze softened slightly. Start by apologizing. Reach out to the customers directly affected by Richard's actions. Offer refunds, yes, but more importantly, offer acknowledgement. Let them know you see what happened and you're making it right. Daniel nodded, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. And what about the public? If word gets out, this could destroy our reputation. Naomi leaned back, folding her hands in her lap. Daniel, the truth is going to come out whether you control the narrative or not. It's better to get ahead of it. Issue a statement, explain what happened, what you're doing to address it, and your commitment to creating a more inclusive environment. Own the mistakes. People will respect that. Daniel squared his shoulders, the hesitation in his eyes hardening into resolve. I'll do it, he said. All of it. And Naomi, I'd like you to stay involved. Your insight has been invaluable, and I think you can help guide us through this transition. Naomi smiled faintly, shaking her head. I appreciate that, Daniel, but my job here was to bring the truth to light. The real work, that's on you. The real work is yours to do, Naomi said, her voice steady but encouraging. That being said, I'm willing to consult in the short term to help you get started. Daniel's eyes softened with relief. That's more than I could ask for, he said sincerely. Naomi glanced down at her notes, pausing thoughtfully. One more thing, she added, meeting his gaze. You should consider donating a portion of the restaurant's profits to organizations that support equity and inclusion. It's not a solution, but it's a step toward making amends. Daniel nodded slowly, the idea sinking in. I'll make it happen. A quiet moment passed as the weight of the conversation settled between them. Finally, Daniel extended his hand. Thank you, Naomi, for everything. You didn't have to do this, but you stayed and helped fix what was broken. That means more than I can express. Naomi shook his hand firmly. I did it because it was the right thing to do, for the customers, the staff, and everyone who deserves better. Now it's up to you to see it through. I will, Daniel said, his expression resolute. I won't let this place fall back into the same patterns. Naomi gathered her notes and stood, offering him a small but confident smile. Good, then we'll see where this goes. As she stepped out of his office, Naomi felt a sense of closure settle over her. Yet, behind it lingered a quiet resolve. The fight for equity and fairness wasn't over, but this victory, small as it might seem, was a step in the right direction. Months later, Naomi's heels clicked softly against the polished marble floor as she stepped through the familiar doors of the restaurant. The atmosphere buzzed with life, the hum of conversation blending with the soft clinking of glasses and silverware. She paused, taking in the subtle yet profound changes. The space radiated warmth and inclusivity, something it had lacked before. A young black host with a welcoming smile greeted her at the stand. Welcome to the Avery, he said warmly. Do you have a reservation? I do, Naomi replied, offering her name. The host scanned the list and nodded. Right this way, Miss Brooks. As she followed him through the dining area, Naomi's eyes swept over the restaurant. Black families and couples filled prime tables, their laughter and conversations blending seamlessly into the ambiance. In one corner, a group of black professionals raised their glasses in a toast, celebrating with ease. Her gaze drifted to a larger table by the window, where a well-known black actress sat surrounded by friends. Naomi smiled faintly, recognizing the star from a recent film. They weren't a spectacle, they were simply part of the room, exactly as it should be. When the host led her to her table, Naomi found Daniel already seated. He rose as she approached, extending a hand with a genuine smile. Naomi, it's good to see you. You too, Daniel, she replied, shaking his hand before settling into her seat. Daniel gestured around the restaurant. So, what do you think? Naomi took a moment, her gaze sweeping across the space. It's different, she said at last, a faint smile touching her lips. Better. Daniel chuckled softly. It's been a journey, that's for sure. But we've made progress, thanks to you. How have the changes been holding up? She asked, folding her hands on the table. Better than I expected, Daniel said. The staff training went well, better than I could have hoped. We also set up an oversight committee to handle any issues that come up, and I've been more involved day to day. It's made all the difference. Naomi's gaze lingered near the window as she watched the room. And the customers? Daniel's expression brightened. We've seen a real shift. People who stopped coming are returning, and word of mouth has brought in new faces. The reputation is improving, but more importantly, people feel welcome here now. Naomi's eyes flicked back to the actress near the window. It's good to see this place thriving, she said softly. But more than that, it's good to see it becoming what you always said it could be, a space for everyone. Daniel nodded solemnly. It wasn't easy getting here, Naomi. We had to earn trust back, one step at a time. And I know the work isn't done yet. But moments like this, he said, gesturing to the room, remind me why we started. As their conversation continued, a server approached. The young woman greeted Naomi with the same warmth she extended to every other table, taking their orders with care. Naomi couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. This wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was proof of what accountability could achieve. When their meals arrived, Daniel lifted his glass. To you, Naomi, he said, for holding me accountable, for pushing me to do better, and for showing me what I couldn't see on my own. Naomi raised her glass, a small smile tugging at her lips. To progress, she replied, and to making sure it sticks. Their glasses clinked, and for a brief moment the weight of the past few months lifted. As Naomi dined, She took in the atmosphere around her. It was no longer just a restaurant. It was a testament to the power of accountability and the resilience of those willing to fight for change. The work wasn't over, but tonight felt like a step toward something better. And the possibility of change lingered in the air. The journey wasn't over, but today was proof that even the smallest victories could lead to something greater. As Naomi stepped out into the cool evening air, she glanced back at the glowing windows of the Avery. Her thoughts drifted to the people inside, the staff, the customers, and the quiet community they were building. A renewed sense of purpose settled over her. Change was never easy, but it was always worth fighting for. The crisp breeze brushed against her skin as she walked to her car, the soft lights from the restaurant casting a warm glow behind her. The visit had given her a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. Pausing by the car, Naomi leaned against the door, gazing back at the restaurant. Months ago, it had been a symbol of exclusion, a place where people like her were made to feel invisible. Now, it was something else entirely. A beacon of change, however small. She slid into the car, the hum of the engine breaking the quiet as she navigated the bustling city streets. The memories played in her mind, the confrontation with Richard, the candid interviews with staff and customers, and the endless conversations with Daniel about what accountability truly looked like. It had been exhausting, frustrating, at times disheartening, but it had been worth it. A week later, Naomi sat in a modest office in the heart of the city. Books on equity and leadership lined the walls, and neatly stacked files covered the desk. Across from her sat an older black woman, her warm smile balanced by a sharp, perceptive gaze. "I heard about the changes at the Avery," the woman said, leaning back in her chair. "You've done remarkable work there." Naomi smiled faintly. "It wasn't just me. Daniel was willing to listen and take action. That made all the difference." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "It's rare to find someone in his position willing to take full responsibility, but it sounds like you didn't give him much choice." Naomi chuckled softly. "I can be persuasive when necessary." The woman's smile widened. "We need more of that. There are plenty of places out there like the Avery was before, where bias hides behind polite smiles and subtle excuses." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Have you thought about continuing this work? Maybe consulting?" Naomi hesitated. The idea had crossed her mind before, but she hadn't given it serious thought. "I've thought about it," she admitted. "I'm just not sure if I'm ready to take it on full time." The woman leaned forward, sliding a card across the desk. "If you ever are," she said with a knowing smile, "give me a call. There's always room for someone with your determination and insight." Naomi took the card and slipped it into her bag. "Thank you," she said. "I'll keep that in mind." That evening, Naomi sat in her apartment, cradling a steaming cup of tea. The city lights twinkled through the window, faint shadows stretching across the walls. Her mind drifted back to the restaurant, to Daniel, the staff, and the customers who had helped shape something better. It wasn't perfect. There would always be more to do, more battles to fight. But for now, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The soft vibration of her phone interrupted the quiet. She glanced at the screen. A message from Daniel. "Daniel, just wanted to thank you again for everything. Couldn't have done it without you. Hope you'll visit again soon." Naomi smiled, setting her cup down to reply. "Naomi, you're welcome. Keep up the good work. Don't let it slide. I'll definitely be back." She placed the phone aside, leaning back into the couch. For the first time in months, she felt a deep sense of closure, not just for herself, but for everyone who had once walked into the Avery and left feeling less than they deserved. Change was slow and sometimes painful, but today it felt just a little closer.